The Life and Death of the Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy.
In this chapter, we learn that Elizabeth's mother has fallen ill and is too unwell to leave her room. Henchard sends for the best doctor he knows, and they burn a light all night to care for her. After a few days, she begins to rally. However, Mrs. Henchard's condition continues to weaken visibly, and she can no longer go outside. Meanwhile, Michael Henchard receives a letter from Jersey in a writing he recognizes all too well. It turns out to be from Lucetta, with whom he had been corresponding before she left Casterbridge. The letter is an unimportant finale to conjecture for Henchard, who reads it as if it were a picture or vision of past enactments. Elizabeth Jane notices that her mother is weakening and wants to write something important. Her mother, Susan, writes a letter addressed to Michael Henchard not to be opened until Elizabeth Jane's wedding day. Elizabeth Jane sits up with her mother every night until she passes away. Before Mrs. Henchard dies, she has a conversation with Elizabeth about Mr. Farfrae and how he would make an excellent husband for her daughter. She also prepares for her death by sealing up the letter she wrote earlier and locking it in her desk with instructions not to open it until Elizabeth Jane's wedding day. Throughout this chapter, we see the relationships between the characters develop and change as they face unexpected challenges and prepare for what lies ahead. 10 bullet points. Phrasal verbs used in this chapter. 1. Fall ill. Mrs. Henchard falls ill and is unable to leave her room. 2. Look at. Henchard takes up the letter from Lucetta in his hands and looks at it as at a picture. 3. Write up. Mrs. Henchard writes something on a piece of paper and seals it up. 4. Lock away. Mrs. Henchard locks the sealed letter in her desk with instructions not to open it until Elizabeth Jane's wedding day. 5. Sit up with. Elizabeth Jane sits up with her mother every night until she passes away. 6. Think over. Mrs. Henchard spends much time thinking over something that seems to distress her. 7. Bring together. Mrs. Henchard reveals that she sent the note to bring Elizabeth Jane and Mr. Farfrae together. 8. Show up. The note sent to Elizabeth Jane and Mr. Farfrae shows up again in their conversation. 9. Pass away. Mrs. Henchard passes away after a long illness, leaving behind important letters for her loved ones. 10. Look forward to. Elizabeth Jane looks forward to her wedding day when she will finally be able to open the sealed letter from her mother. Some collocations used in this chapter. 1. Burn a light. They burnt a light all night while Mrs. Henchard was ill. 2. Send for. Henchard sends for the richest, busiest doctor to attend to his wife. 3. Lock in. Mrs. Henchard locks the sealed letter in her desk with instructions not to open it until Elizabeth Jane's wedding day. 4. Write something. Mrs. Henchard says she wants to write something before she passes away. 5. Stay up. Elizabeth Jane stays up with her mother every night until she passes away. 6. Weaken visibly. Mrs. Henchard weakens visibly and is unable to go out of doors anymore. 7. Direct a letter. Mrs. Henchard directs a letter addressed to Michael Henchard not to be opened until Elizabeth Jane's wedding day. 8. Foresee an approaching jerk. Elizabeth foresees the approaching jerk from some channel across the highway, just as she had foreseen her mother's illness. 9. Treat kindly. Henchard treats his wife kindly except in moments of irritation. 10. Rallied after an illness. Mrs. Henchard rallied after a few days of being ill.